So hi, everyone. Thank you for making it to our third and last session for our food safety series with Berger Food Safety. I have Lisa Berger here from Berger Food Safety who will be leading our presentation today. Today, we're going to be focusing on date marking and what else? I don't have the slides next to me. Date marking is the big one, the very technical talk today. So I'm going to pass it on to Lisa, but again, so whoever just came in, like I said to the other people, please put your name and establishment in the chat so I can keep a record of everyone who's come in. We are recording the session so that everyone will have access to this video later this week. We're going to be uploading it. So I'm all set. I'm going to pass it on to Lisa.
Welcome back, everybody, for the third and final training. And I feel like each week has gotten progressively technical. And I would say tonight is definitely the most technical of all. So if you don't already have a piece of paper and a pen, grab one because you're going to be taking notes. So I'm going to start to share my screen. Give me just a second here. And I have to share first, and then I'll put you in here. And can you please let me know, Diana, if we are at the proper section here?
Yes, I can see everything. We should be all set.
Okay, and just a reminder for everybody, since I do have my PowerPoint presentation in full screen mode, I cannot see any of you. I cannot see any questions or hands going up. So if you do have a question, put your hand up or wave your hand or put a question up in the chat, and Diana will be able to ask me to stop or relay the information to me. So tonight we're going to start with date marking, which is very technical. Using time as a public health control is also very technical. Then the easy stuff, I have a video, and we'll be talking about setting up a 3-bay sink and your sanitizing solutions. Another section on the requirements for cleaning up vomiting and diarrheal incidents. So the SOPs that are required and cleanup kit requirements. And because all of this is very technical and there may be some questions bringing us to our 6:30 stop time, I put my very last topic, integrated pest management, as a space filler if we have time, but it's not as technical and very much common sense. So I wanted to start with more technical first. And that starts with date marking. I believe we talked last week a little bit about how the food code has all the code or regulations in the first part of the code, and then there's some rationale and some information in the various chapters or appendices in the back. And one of them talks about why we have date marking, which I will go into more explanation about. But really the intent here is to target a specific pathogen, and that is Listeria monocytogenes. So I know, oh gosh, probably 75 to 90% of you are certified, are ServSafe certified. We addressed this the very first day, and you may remember talking about this or being tested on this, but just as a reminder, this is a pathogen that is ubiquitous. It is everywhere. And there's basically two types or two forms. One of them is a non-invasive, and for our really non-susceptible or not highly susceptible populations or general healthy adults, we might get mild illness, like a typical foodborne illness, but there's one that's much more serious, and that's an invasive version, which would be much more dangerous for our highly susceptible populations. And as a reminder, this would be our pregnant women, our elderly, those who have some condition that weakens their immune system. And just to give you an idea, when I talk about Listeria in my classes, for pregnant women, if they become infected, they are at a much greater risk of having a miscarriage in the first trimester of their pregnancy. During the second trimester, they're at a much greater risk of the baby dying in utero. Or if they become infected at the very tail end of their pregnancy, they're at a much, or the baby is at a much greater risk of being born with meningitis and having lifelong complications. So another high-risk population would be somebody who may have had a bone marrow transplant. There's statistics that indicate that somebody who has had a bone marrow transplant is at a 2,500 times greater chance of dying from this than the general healthy adult population. And if you think about that, 2,500 times, not 2 times, not 10 times, but 2,500 times greater chance of dying from this. So this is a very serious pathogen that the food code really controls for. And one of the measures is the requirements for date marking. So this is where we're going to get a little technical. So just a reminder of some of the terminology that we talked about the first day. And I'm going to use my cursor. Hopefully you can see this. A TCS food, as a reminder, is those foods that require time temperature control for safety. So we call them time temperature control for safety foods. And that would be my high protein animal-based food items. Again, that's going to be my heat treated plant foods, i.e. cooked fruits or vegetables, and then some of those other items that don't fit into those two categories. And then RTE foods that you're seeing here is ready to eat foods. So those are foods that require no cooking, no further cooking or processing, such as washing before they're consumed. So here's where we're getting technical. So all TCS ready to eat foods that you prepare on site that are going to be stored for more than 24 hours must be date marked. And this date mark is the date in which this product is either going to be consumed or the date that you have to discard this product. So what the code says is the date is 7 days from the day in which this item was prepared. Now, what's confusing here is the date of preparation counts as day 1. And this is where I see some of the big mistakes here. So for example, the picture that you see in the slide is a picture of a chicken salad sandwich. So let's say this chicken salad sandwich is prepared today. So the chicken was cooked, it was cooled, it was prepared today. And I always have to use my fingers, and I'm not sure if you can see my fingers, but I'm going to do this. So today is the 22nd. So this counts as day number 1, and I will count 7 days. So we have the 22nd, 23rd, 24th, 25th, 26th, 27th, 28th. So what I'm going to use this terminology, the expiration date or the date in which this has to be consumed or discarded is going to be November 28th. So what I find works for some people when I'm talking to managers or supervisors, a lot of people understand this, but relaying this to some of their employees is a little confusing. So another way that I have told people to kind of get this in the head so we have the proper date marking is the day that you prep it, add 6 to that, and that will bring you to the same date. Whatever date that you can use or system that you can explain it to your employees so we have the proper dates here. One thing that I didn't mention about Listeria, and so I'm doing a little reverse here. Listeria is a bacteria that actually will grow at temperatures lower than we normally store our refrigerated products. So the way that we control this from growing to dangerous levels is to limit the number of days that we store that in a refrigerator. So sorry, I didn't talk about that at the beginning, but this is why we have a specific time in which our products, our TCS products, can be stored in a refrigerator. So then here's another item. So again, we're talking about refrigerated TCS ready to eat foods. Now we're talking about something that's prepared and packaged by food processing plants. So not the chicken salad sandwich that you made on the previous slide. This is something that you may purchase. It could be cottage cheese. Maybe it's some creamer for your coffee or milk or whatever. So TCS ready to eat foods that are packaged by a processing plant also has to have the date marking. Now there's a couple requirements here. First, we need to document the time in which the container was opened. And then if it's held in a refrigerator for more than 24 hours, we need to date mark the date in which it's to be consumed or discarded, just like the food that we had prepared on site. So just like the food that we prepared on site, the date identified is 7 days from the day in which that container was opened. That opening of that container counts as day number 1. One of the things when it comes from foods that are prepared or packaged by a processing plant is they will almost always have a manufacturer pull date. And one of the things that I did to demonstrate how I ask people to date mark these items is, for example, let's say this picture of cottage cheese had a manufacturer pull date of December 22nd. Once that is opened, first, we're going to write the date that it's open. And what I've asked my clients to do, so there's no confusion, is actually cross off that December 22nd date. Obviously, if we open it today, it's not going to last for an entire month. So I want to write the date that it's open. So let's say this was open on November 19th, a couple of days ago. I want to cross off this December 22nd date, and then we have a new expiration date. So since it was opened on the 19th, I'm going to start with my finger counting. The 19th, 20, 21, 22nd, 23rd, 24th, November 25th is the date that we need to identify on this container. One thing that you absolutely can do is you can always do less time. That's going to be safer. If you want to have a 2-day, 3-day, 5-day date marking date or expiration date, that is perfectly acceptable. You cannot exceed this date, because at that point, the listeria can grow to dangerous levels that may or may not make us healthy young individuals sick, but those people who are highly susceptible, who are consuming this food, can absolutely get very ill from these items. Now going to a third and deeper level. So we're back to all refrigerated TCS ready to eat foods. If you add an ingredient to something that's prepared on site that was cooked previously, the date marking must be the date. We need to start from the earliest prepared or first prepared ingredient. And this is a little confusing, so I have pictures here which helps me. So let's say on November 18th, you cooked some chicken and then cooled it, put it in the refrigerator, intending to use it for whatever. Maybe you're going to make chicken salad or whatever. On today's date, you decide that you're going to make chicken salad from this already cooked and cooled chicken. We need to start with this original date that chicken was cooked. So if we cooked it on the 18th, again, I'm going to use my fingers. We have the 18th, 19th, 20th, 21st, 22nd, 21st, and 22nd. So November 22nd is going, I'm so sorry. I'm going to start over again. Cooked on the 18th. We're preparing it today. The expiration date is the 7 days from the initial date that chicken was cooked. Sorry for the confusion. So 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24th, November 24th is the item that has to be dated with this date. Any questions here, since I flubbed that up a little bit? And I'll give you a second to either raise your hand, speak up, or I will move on. All right. So hopefully I explained that well enough. The food code does allow for alternative procedures if you don't want to use the exact date marking, because there are certain situations in which it doesn't really make sense. For example, if you have any TCS ready to eat foods, we're getting back to that terminology, that is frequently rewrapped, such as luncheon meats or roast, like in a deli, there can be alternative procedures. And I do have a client that has, and it's a small kind of grocery chain. They have a couple of deli cases where they have it mapped out. So they might have their bologna and their turkey and their honey turkey in very specific areas. And then they have it mapped out in a log. So they keep a log for their date marking for these items. And they will write when a product was opened. So they will use that date on the log. And then when it's either consumed or discarded, they will have that date on the log. And that is a method that has seemed to work well. And the health authority in this town has approved of this method. So as you can see by my notes here, it does have to be approved by the health department in order to do this. There's another situation where this may not work. And an example is in a soft serve mix, like an ice cream machine, or maybe in a milk dispensing machine. Obviously, it doesn't make sense to have the date marking on those packaging. So an example or an alternative method that we could use here is maybe a log or piece of paper or something on the machine or near the machine that indicates the date that product had been put in the machine, it's opened, and then again, the date in which it's supposed to be consumed or discarded. And all of these, it's the day of opening or date of preparation that counts as day number 1, and we go up to 7 days. Again, I'm talking about alternatives if approved. Another alternate method that may be used, and this is directly from the food code, so I'm just going to read this to you. So using calendar dates, days of the week, color-coded marks, or other effective marking methods, provided that the marking system is disclosed to the regulatory authority upon request. So this is a picture that I have from Friday when I was in doing an inspection, and there were numerous areas where they had some date marking issues, but for some reason they happened to have their sliced tomatoes date marked with these stamps. And as all of you should be familiar with, a sliced tomato is defined in the food code as a TCS food. It's ready to eat. So on Friday, I was doing an inspection and I saw these little stickers, and I don't know if you can see this well enough, so I'm going to verbally describe this, but the tomatoes were sliced on the Thursday. I observed this on Friday, and their corporate standards are to use this product within 2 days by Saturday. So this little sticker here was a great little system. I don't know if this was approved by the health department locally, but I was happy to see this system that they had put in place. Date marking, there are a handful of items that this does not apply to. And here's another confusing thing about the date marking requirements is that it seems there's more exceptions to the rules than the rules. So I'm going to go over a few of those, but date marking doesn't apply to individual meal portions served or repackaged for sale from a bulk container upon a customer's request. And the key words here are upon a customer's request. So you can repackage it, put a lid on it, put it in a bag, ring it up, sell it. It doesn't have to be date marked. And then the other exception is live mollusk and shellfish. So we're dealing with clams or mussels or oysters. These do not have to be date marked as well. Oh my, you got a whole list. I told you there are a whole bunch of other things. So the date marking also doesn't apply to any of these other food items. And I do realize some of you may be looking at the screen or the slide from a small screen, or maybe you're on your phone and you don't have access to the slides here. So I'm going to read through some of these. I do apologize for reading a slide, but this doesn't apply to deli salads that you might purchase, such as ham salad, chicken salad, pasta salad, macaroni salad. These products are exempt because the manufacturers will often acidify these salads. They may add some type of acidifying agent. Do you have a question? Okay, or they might add some preservatives that is intended to give this product a life. So those are going to be exempt. I do have a whole list of hard and semi-soft cheeses that are exempt from this as well. And by the way, I did put together a summary of those specific items that are exempt from the date marking. And in terms of the hard and soft cheese, I also have a full list of those that would be exempt as well. But soft cheeses would include blue cheese, Gorgonzola, Monterey Jack, cultured dairy products. It could be yogurt, it could be sour cream or buttermilk. And this is what becomes confusing. In a walk-in cooler, you might have a whole bunch of dairy products in a refrigerator. You might have your milk and your cream and your cottage cheese along with your yogurt, your sour cream, and your buttermilk. The code only requires that those non-cultured dairy products are date marked. So your milk has to be date marked. Your cottage cheese, your cream has to be date marked, but the yogurt, sour cream, and buttermilk don't. So how do you train your employees on what needs to be date marked and what doesn't? One of the things that I've had people do is just to be consistent is to have people date mark everything. But the downfall or the negative side to that is we might be discarding product unnecessarily that doesn't necessarily have to be discarded. And we can talk about that later. And maybe if somebody has a question about that when we're done.
Lisa, there is a question in the chat asking if yogurt or sour cream, would that just need an open date, not the date mark to use by?
That's a good question. Give me an example of, if this person could give me an example of what they would use for an open date on there. And if not, I can come back to this, but obviously it's not going to last forever in the refrigerator. Sometimes you'll start to see them get moldy before we would put an open date on there. But this is a good question. I don't know.
They ask, or it's like the day that they break the seal. Would that be the open date?
I would definitely want to know when that was opened. Absolutely would want to know when that product has been opened, and just about every dairy product. And I know people who did this for everything that comes into their establishments, whether they're TCS foods or not, is to indicate the date in which the package was open, whether it's a bag of bread, crackers, or whatever. And this would be just good retail practices. That would not be code. But I do want to come back to the date for an open dating. So let me get back to that. Exempted items would include any preserved fish products, so pickled herring, other acidified fish products. Again, this bacteria of concern does not do well in acidic conditions or dry conditions, which is why fermented sausages, pepperoni would not be date marked. And then finally, shelf stable products. They're shelf stable, meaning they're really not TCS food items. Any items that are not properly date marked need to be discarded. And there's 3 very specific requirements here in the code. Number 1, if any product that requires date marking exceeds the time or temperature combination. So again, we want temperatures from day 1, temperatures 41 or colder as our goal, or time. If we exceed that 7 days, this product must be discarded. And you'll notice on this section that if the product is frozen, this is an exemption to this rule, which I'm going to talk about at the next slide. So not talking about frozen items, anything that exceeds the time temperature combination, they need to be discarded. Secondly, if a container or a package does not have a date or day in which it was prepared or opened, and this is when a health inspector could come in and see some open products, tuna salad or beans that have been opened with no dates. That can be, they can request that you discard these packaging, even if you knew it was opened yesterday or 2 days ago. If it doesn't have a date or a day, it's going to have to be discarded. And then the third one is if something is properly marked, but it's exceeding that date. Or let me give you an example. In terms of what would need to be discarded, a lot of the places that I've worked with, when there's a little bit of a language barrier, the 7 days is confusing for some people. I have noticed that they're starting to put 8 days. So that 8th day is their expiration date, but that's exceeded what is allowed in the food code. So I'm going to go through this again. If it exceeds the time temperature requirements, except for frozen products, if it doesn't have a date or a day, and then if it's appropriately marked with the day or date that exceeds the temperature and time combination specified. So what if it's frozen? This is a big question. I was in a place doing an inspection a couple of weeks ago, and they had multiple shelves of smoked salmon. And smoked salmon that's in a vacuum package bag. So it's in the Teflon vacuum package bag. If there's not specific requirements on how to thaw, it must be removed from the packaging. We talked about this, I think, on day 1, completely removed from the packaging if it's going to be thawed in the refrigerator. However, I saw a whole bunch of thawed smoked salmon in a walk-in cooler with dates of May, June, and July. So to me, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, these products are expired by 3 and 4 months. And I was telling the chef that they needed to discard everything. And he said, no, we just thawed them out. We just took them out of the refrigerator, which is a whole nother story. But my point was, as a regulator, I don't know how long they've been out. Have they exceeded the safe time? So what would be recommended when something gets put in a freezer? You should document the date that it goes in a freezer. Could stay in there a month, 6 months, a year. A freezer basically suspends the pathogen growth. Once it comes out, then you want to write the date that it's been removed from the freezer. So we pretty much have isolated that period where a product is in a freezer. Do I have any questions about that? Because again, this is another technical part of the date marking discussion. All right, I'm going to move on. I've talked everything I know about, or that I could possibly talk about for date marking. The next technical topic is using time as a public health control. So time as a public health control. From talking day one, we talked about the temperature danger zone. And I think I told everybody your goal in life is to keep your TCS foods out of the temperature danger zone, which is 41 to 135. However, I know that some of you learned either from your serve safe classes, or maybe we had talked about this, that we know based on science that our TCS foods are going to be safe in the danger zone for up to 6 hours. And for some cold foods, it can last a little bit longer. So you can't just willy-nilly let your food, your TCS food, sitting out of temperature control for really more than an hour. And that's how Massachusetts interpreted this regulation. If you do, you need to provide written procedures for the health department indicating that you would like to use time rather than temperature as your public health control. So I'm going to slow down here for a minute. Are there any questions up to this point? Because I'm going to go deeper into this. Okay, so we know.
Lisa, sorry, there was one question in the chat.
Okay.
Someone before previous topic. So they're a seafood retailer and wholesaler. The majority of their product is sold the same day or the next day. So they weren't time stamping anything. So if they're inspected, would they be at risk that the inspector asks them to dispose of their product?
So if they have a TCS food that's been opened.
So it's like fish, seafood that is caught. So it's like sold either the same day that they get it and process it or the next day.
Is it raw?
I believe so.
I'm not worried about raw. This is a TCS ready to eat food. So ready to eat food indicates it's ready to eat. So it's cooked, it's reheated, it's been washed if it's a fruit or vegetable. So not if it's a raw product.
Okay. That's the only question that I've had so far.
Okay, so getting back to time as a public health control. So we know that food is safe up to 4 hours. For cold food, it's up to 6 hours, and I'll get there in a minute. But if you want to hold it for more than an hour, you have to have written procedures in advance that is submitted to the health department. The regulatory authority has to be maintained and made available to your inspector when they come in. So cold food actually has two possibilities. Cold food can technically be out of temperature control for up to 6 whole hours, providing that that product does not exceed 70 degrees. And I will get into a little more detail. That's a long time, but if you remember from one of those very first slides from 2 weeks ago, I had the temperature danger zone, and then I had something called an extreme danger zone, which was 70 to 125. So if we keep that cold food below that extreme zone, it is technically safe for up to 6 hours. Now, if that food is going to exceed 70 degrees, then we have to stick with the 4 hours. So 4 hours would be the allowed time that that cold food is sitting in the temperature danger zone. Hot food has one possibility. Any hot food that is going to be out of temperature control can be out of temperature control for up to 4 hours. There's no extension or additional time on that. And I'm going to give you an example, 2 examples of food items that would be under time as a public health control. I've done a couple of SOPs for pizza shops that might cook multiple pizza pies at 11 or 11:30, and then they are displayed, near college town, and then people will come in and just order some slices. So what I've done is I would put little tags on each individual pizza on the front side of the tag that is visible to the customers that might identify what type of pizza it is. So pepperoni, cheese, margarita pizza, whatever. And on the back of that tag, I would have them write the time that product was cooked and taken from temperature control and the time in which it must be consumed or discarded. And then that information would go into a log. I'm working on some SOPs right now for another establishment that really wants to use time as a public health control for everything that's going into their hot wells and cold wells. So what they have developed is a sticker system that will, once they check the temperature, and I'm going to get into this, it has to be hot or cold before it goes into time as a public health control. Once they check the temperature, they will identify the time and then identify the discard date, put that sticker on the pan, and that pan is reviewed every like 2 or 3 hours by the person in charge. So that is time as a public health control. Cold food has 2 possibilities, hot food has 1. Now we have a lot more information. We're getting deeper into time as a public health control. So if we are going to exclusively use time as a public health control for 4 hours, whether it's cold food up to 4 hours or hot food up to 4 hours, the food needs to be marked or somehow identified when we are past the 4-hour point when it's removed from temperature control. And I just gave 2 examples how we did this. One is in the pizza, that little tag that's in the pizza, or maybe on the pan. I've had people put up little flags in the food, multiple ways that the food could be marked or identified. Then the food should be cooked and served at any temperature if ready to eat or discarded within 4 hours from the point in time when the food is removed from temperature control. So the food can be cooked and served at any temperature if ready to eat or discarded within 4 hours from the point of time when it's removed from temperature control. And finally, food in unmarked containers or packages are marked to exceed that 4 hours needs to be discarded. And this is very similar to the date marking. If a health inspector came in and these foods that you identified are going to be held out of temperature control using time as a public health control, but there's no marked containers or packages or any way to identify these items, they are going to have to be discarded. Now the 6 hours. So if time without temperature control is used for up to 6 hours. And again, this is only allowed for cold food items. The food needs to initially have a temperature of 41 or colder when it's removed from temperature control. And as I indicated before, it cannot exceed 70 degrees within that 6-hour period. If it does exceed that 6-hour period, obviously the food is going to have to be discarded. Also the food, and I realize time-wise I'm going to have to move a little more quickly, but the food again needs to be marked when it's removed from temperature control. And if we are at any point past that 6 hours, it's going to have to be discarded. So I'm going to go back to my initial cold and hot food scenario here. When food goes into or comes out of temperature control, and we're going to use time as a public health control, we need to make sure that cold food is 41 or colder before it's removed from temperature control. For hot food, it must be 135 or higher before removing from temperature control. At that 4-hour mark, or with cold food, I'm switching slides now, at that 6-hour mark, it has to be discarded if it hasn't been consumed. I am going to stop at this point to answer any questions that you might have.
If anyone has questions, you could raise your hand or put it into the chat. So Lisa, going back on that, the fish question that we had before. So it's a seafood retailer and wholesaler. They do sell cooked shrimp. They wanted to know if the packing label would be considered the date mark in that situation.
If this is a retail situation and they have cooked shrimp, I would say that has to be date marked. So the date that was cooked is going to be the date that counts as day number 1, and the maximum time is going to be 7 days from that. So if it's cooked, absolutely, you're going to want to have that date marked. If it's raw, it does not have to be date marked.
I think that answered the question.
Okay.
And I don't see any other questions or hands raised at the moment.
Okay. Getting back to the 6-hour date marking. So just to review, cold food, it can either be 4 hours, as long as it's discarded after 4 hours. It can be held up for 6 hours as long as the product never exceeds 70 degrees. For hot food, it's going to be 4 hours. It has to be temped at 135 before it comes out of temperature control, and then after 4 hours for hot food, it must be discarded. Couple more things. I mentioned this before. Food shall be discarded for the 6-hour time period if it exceeds 70 degrees. One of the things that you'll notice on the very bottom of this slide is any food establishment that serves a highly susceptible population, they may not use time as a public health control for raw eggs. So I believe some of you might be from highly susceptible populations. So this is something to be very, very conscientious about, that this cannot be used for a highly susceptible population. So if you were in a nursing home, hospital, any other situation where you might have susceptible people. The next thing I wanted to talk about, and actually before I move on to cleaning and sanitizing, using time as a public health control, it's very confusing. The difference between cold and hot in 4 and 6 hours is a little confusing. Before I move on, I just want to open this up to anybody who might have questions at this. And if you don't have any questions, Diana, if people are willing to identify whether or not this is something that they are currently using in their establishments. And if they are and haven't identified, maybe they're going to be adding themselves in a public seminar or public group here. Maybe they don't want to identify they're doing this if they haven't already notified you. But if anybody's using this, they already have their plans reviewed by the health department. I'm just curious to know, do we have any?
We have a handful, very few people who have formally done it. I haven't caught too many people doing it without letting us know.
And one thing to make clear, and that you can't, you have to plan for this in advance. You can't just say, oh, I know it's going to be safe for 4 hours and leave it at that. You have to identify what food it is. You need to have it in writing. You need to have Diana or somebody from the health department review it. You need to make sure that you're monitoring temperatures before it goes into or it comes out of holding. So there are very specific requirements. You can't just say, hey, it's out of temperature control. Well, we're using time as a public health control. It has to be a very deliberate process that you are following. Cleaning and sanitizing. This is one thing that I often like to demonstrate, but being on a Zoom meeting, it's very difficult to do that. So I'm pulling a video that we had recorded, oh gosh, probably last May or June. This is in COVID time, so there is going to be reference to COVID, but I am going to start this video on proper setup for a 3-bay sink and testing sanitizing solutions. And Diana, I do want to make sure that you're able to hear and see everything. So I'm going to start it right now.
Since you've been closed for a couple of weeks, it could have been months, since you've last operated your 3-bay sink, we want to make sure, number one, it's cleaned and sanitized prior to use. Okay. Number two, make sure it's fully stocked. Make sure you have your detergent solutions, your sanitized solutions. Make sure your dispensers are working properly. Make sure you have a thermometer and make sure you have the proper test strips to test your sanitized solution. Okay. What you're going to do for your 3-bay sink is you're going to actually pre-soak and scrape all your soiled equipment first, okay, when you're actually using the sink. After I've cleaned and sanitized my sink, I have filled my sink, all right? I have my hot soapy water in the first bay. The middle bay, I'm actually keeping empty. I'm going to use running water for that. And the third bay is our sanitized bay, and we are using a quaternary ammonium compound in this bay. So we want to maintain the temperature of the wash bay at 110 degrees Fahrenheit or above. Right now, we're at about 128 degrees, so it's perfect. Always make sure that these solutions are maintained clean. If as they get soiled, change them out. So the third bay, the sanitized bay, because we're using a quaternary ammonium compound, it has to be maintained at a minimum of 75 degrees. Right now, we're at 76.4, so we're good to go. And again, maintain this solution clean. The third bay, the sanitized bay, you want to make sure you test it to make sure it's at the proper concentration. Okay. You are required to have test strips available for the chemical that you're using. Today, we are using the quaternary ammonium compounds or quats. These do expire, so please check your expiration dates. Simple way to do this is just pull a piece off, tear it off, put it right into that third bay. The concentration should be anywhere between 200 and 400 parts per million for this chemical. Read your manufacturer's instructions. Each chemical is a little bit different. This one is about a 7-second dip, 7 to 10 second dip. So check it afterwards and you can see we're right about 300 parts per million. So we're perfect. So once you've tested it, you we recommend about 300 parts per million because this does dissipate. Ecolab, for this chemical, it is a range. It goes from 150 to 400 parts per million. If you set it at 150 parts per million, it's going to dissipate within half an hour. So you're going to be refilling your chemical again. So let me walk through how you would actually wash. So this is the soiled side of the drain board. You would have soiled equipment on this side. The first step you would do is that pre-soak scrape step. Okay. And once you get rid of that food debris is when you would actually use your wash step. Okay. So I'm going to take my containers and I'm going to put them in. Take my scrubby. And this has to be maintained again at 110 degrees Fahrenheit. So I'm going to scrub these down. And I usually just tuck them in here. I do them in batches. And this is the rinse bay. So the rinse bay, I like to have flowing water. And I'll drop it right into the sanitized bay. Needs a full contact time. Again, this is the Ecolab 146. So this needs to sit in here for a full minute to kill all the bacteria and the viruses. After a minute, take it out, invert it, and you want to let it air dry. It's a good idea to have extra racks as well that are open so you can allow it to dry by itself. Never towel dry, it has to be air dried. So it's really important to follow these steps. This isn't just for COVID-19, this is for normal food safety practices. And if you do it the proper way, you can assure that all your customers and your employees will have a safe dining experience. Since you've been closed,
I am sorry about that. Are we all set with the video?
Yep, already on the next slide.
Next thing I wanted to point out is sanitizing buckets, talking about different ways to get these set up, because often we will come into places and maybe their 3-bay sink is set up, it has a proper concentration, yet the buckets are not at the proper concentration. So a couple of notes here. Often when people are using, like Eileen had talked about in the video, something like the Quat sanitizer solution, one of the things that I recommend for people is to have their 3-bay sink set up. They test the concentration, it's good, and then they can fill their buckets from that third tank. Works beautifully that way. They've already tested it. But keep in mind that the buckets do dilute after a period of time, which is why she recommended starting at a higher concentration. But anytime they become soiled, after they've been used for a couple of hours, to switch them out, clean and sanitize the bucket, refill it, test the concentration again. Sometimes I do have people, if they're just using a dish machine and they don't have their 3-bay sink set up routinely and they're having to mix their own, they may not know the exact amount. If it's not automatically being dispensed, they're having to manually measure it. And I actually had to do this at a client recently. They had no idea how much chlorine to put in, so they were just pouring from the bottle into the 3-bay sink, and it was off the charts high. So what I was recommending is, until you know exactly how much you need to mix, start in small increments. So I had them fill up the sink to a certain level. They would fill a teaspoon or a tablespoon with the sanitizing solution, whether it's quartz or chlorine or whatever, put it in the sink, mix it and test it. And it will start off really low, and then they would continue to add a little bit until they came up with a proper concentration. And then they could determine exactly how much sanitizer is used, either for the sink or the bucket. Can be used both ways. The very last thing that I want to talk about, we may or may not have time to get into pest control, as I suspected. But the very last thing that I want to talk about that's the most complicated is the new requirements that came out October of 2018 regarding the need to have SOPs for cleanup procedures when there is what I call a bio incident. So if somebody vomited in the kitchen or in a dining room, or they had diarrhea, something happens, you do need to have specific procedures on how they are to be cleaned up. There's supposed to be very specific items in your kit that is going to be available to clean up these incidents. And just like I was talking about with using date marking, and we're dealing with a target pathogen, and again with date marking, that was Listeria, with the cleanup SOPs and cleanup kits, really the target pathogen here is norovirus. And I think I may have talked about norovirus the very first day, but if you have not heard of this, and I'm assuming most of you had, particularly if you are ServSafe certified, this is what people remember as the cruise ship virus. And I do have a lot of statistics on here, and I do realize that some of you are looking at this on either a small screen or you have logged in on your phone and don't see this. So I'm going to read some of these statistics from the CDC. We'll go through them. So norovirus is currently the most common foodborne illness in the United States. And depending on the statistics that you look at, it represents between about 56 or 58% of all foodborne illness outbreaks. There are about 21 million cases of gastroenteritis that is due to norovirus infection alone. And the very interesting thing about this pathogen, not only is this transmitted through food from consuming contaminated food or from person to person, but people can inhale these viral droplets and become infected with this, which is very interesting. Most every other foodborne illness, whether it's some of the bacteria or hepatitis A, which is another viral foodborne illness, it is either person to person or consuming contaminated food. This is the only one that can be acquired by inhaling and thus swallowing the virus. But the symptoms for some people, very sudden onset of vomiting and diarrhea, and often both can be explosive. This is how it's described in the food code. Because of this, you really need to have effective cleanup procedures for the vomitous and fecal matter, which I'm going to be talking about. But I do want to show a video. I always recommend people watch this video. It's a true indicator of why we need to have these cleanup kits and SOPs available for an incident like this. And this is actually the first time I'm showing this video in a class, so I'm very interested to get your input on what you think about this.
Hi, I'm Catherine Makeson-Booth and I'm a microbiologist here at the Health and Safety Laboratory, Buxton, Derbyshire. I've invented a simulated vomiting system known as Vomiting Larry. So let's go inside and meet him. We're in one of HSL's controlled air chambers, and this is where Vomiting Larry lives. He's comprised of a mannequin head known as Airway Larry, and is what medical students use to practice procedures such as laryngoscopies. He has a tongue and teeth so that fluid is projected in a realistic way. The esophagus is connected to a chamber representing Larry's stomach, to which we add fluid. A pneumatic ram then forces the fluid up and out of his mouth. I'm going to fill Larry's stomach with 1 litre of fluorescent fluid so that under UV lighting we can track small droplets and splash that under standard white lighting would be invisible. Just seen the test under UV lighting. We've now switched the standard lights back on. I'm going to try and clean up from the cleanest areas to the dirtiest areas to avoid contaminating myself. The polar fluid that I can actually see. Switch the standard lights off, put the UV lights back on, and see how well I've actually done. I can see areas that I've missed. A lot of areas where there's splash around the edges of where the main bulk of the fluid was. Apparently I've contaminated my face, my nose and my mouth. so I must have touched my face during the cleanup procedure. I've also contaminated my hand and the cuff of my overalls. This is the hand that I was using to clean up the fluid. I've contaminated the knee that I was using to kneel on during the cleanup process, and the underneath of my shoe covers are also contaminated. Our research has shown that droplets as small as these can contain enough virus to elicit an infection in a healthy individual. And that's why our work with Larry in helping to prevent infection is so important.
So, really quick, I don't know if you're able to unmute yourself or maybe put a comment in if this video was helpful in understanding the rationale and reasons behind the requirements for cleanup procedures and a vomit kit.
Someone said that they wanted one.
I love the mannequin. It truly shows a person who is getting sick here. But I've shown this to my staff when we initially passed this regulation in Massachusetts. Again, this was about 3 years ago, and it really kind of struck them as to why we need to have these procedures in place. It makes a whole lot of sense. And this has all come about because of what's been going on with norovirus over the last, I don't know, 10, 15 years. When I first started teaching this class, it wasn't nearly a problem that it is right now. But as I indicated, procedures are absolutely required for employees to follow when they are responding to vomiting or diarrheal events. And I have these available. There's a ton of stuff that's available online that you could download and print or have available. But just a very quick summary of the requirements that would need to be in your SOPs. And here's the reason why SOPs are required. When somebody throws up in your dining room, in your kitchen, you are in panic mode. You might not remember what to do. Having written procedures available when you need them so you don't have to think about it is going to be the best way to manage the situation. But one of the very first things which makes sense from watching the video is you need to remove all people, so employees, customers, remove food items, remove any single service items. So if you have straws out or napkins or cups or cup lids, remove these from the area. We have to assume that they're contaminated. And you can clearly see the risk of contamination when you watch that video. For diarrheal events, generally it's not going to be the same as vomiting. So really you can focus just on that area. But if somebody does have an incident when they are throwing up, especially like what you saw in the video, you have to assume that you have a 25-foot radius where that virus could have spread. And depending on some of your establishments, depending on how big you are, that might be your basically your entire kitchen or your entire dining room. So in cases like this, you need to close your doors. You need to call the health department to let them know what's going on. In larger establishments, let's say in hotels or in colleges, it may be a situation where just that area could be closed down. But you really need to have employees trained in the cleanup procedures. It's very, very important, as you can see from the video, that personal protective equipment needs to be worn. She had the virus all over herself when she was done. The last thing, and one of the important things, is that gloves are put on last. Also, it's highly, highly recommended that non-cooks, non-food prep people do this cleanup. And obviously, this is because of the spreading that virus from the cook who becomes contaminated to food that they're going to be prepping. But there are examples of some absorbent materials. So if you have an incident where somebody throws up, you need to have some type of material soak up the liquid. So there's different types of materials that I'm going to be talking about, but then you need to be using scoops and paper towels to remove the debris, and it should be discarded in the bag. And it's also important to be very careful to remove and discard your gloves, and really think of it as toxic waste, basically, when you're cleaning up an incident like this. Once we've cleaned it up, we need to make sure that hands are washed thoroughly. We talked a little bit about hand washing and proper procedures for that on our first day, but soap and water needs to be used on all surfaces in the area. And just like we had to do with COVID, think about all those other areas that you don't normally think of needing to be cleaned with soap and water. So doorknobs, railings, corners, any places that are frequently touched. This is terminology that we're familiar with. And then restrooms. Even if you don't think a restroom has been affected, chances are pretty good the sick person then went and used the restroom to clean up themselves. So you have to assume that the restrooms are going to be contaminated as well. But any of the hardened pore surfaces need to be disinfected. And there's many different ways that we can disinfect. And the SOPs that I have different concentrations and different brands of bleach and how to mix them. They do have approved disinfectants off of the EPA's list G. I'm going to be talking about that. But the amount or the designated contact time is really going to vary from product to product. If you are using any type of bleach, it may be a situation where the windows need to be opened. But once you're finished cleaning the mess, you need to dispose of the paper towels, all the personal protective equipment, put it in the bag, tie it off, put it in the trash. But if you are using a disinfectant, and this is probably similar to what we were talking about with COVID, the disinfectants, if they are on food contact surfaces, they need to be rinsed with fresh water, and then you would have to re-sanitize them with your regular sanitizing solution. In establishments that were small enough and had to be closed, I mentioned that if you're very small, you can't really cordon off an area. You just have to close your doors. You should call your health department back. So call Diana, whoever's at the health department, let them know that you are ready to reopen after you've gone through these procedures. But keep in mind, they may want to come out and visit and review the procedures with you before you do reopen. But it is critical because once you have this virus in there, if it's not cleaned up, you're going to have problems. You're going to have an outbreak, and not just one, but it could be a reoccurring issue. Now, in terms of a cleanup kit, our food code that we adopted says it's highly recommended. It's not technically required in the food code, but I strongly recommend to all of my clients that they do have this cleanup kit. And the reason for this is you don't know when something's going to happen. And if something happens and you have to run to the store and purchase everything that you're going to need, you're going to be closed down for a while. You want to be ready when something happens. So in terms of the personal protective equipment, I alluded to this a little bit in the procedures, but you need to have disposable gloves. You probably have them already there. Eye shields, I have found during COVID that a lot of places purchased and has eye shields available now. They currently have eye shields, but disposable shoe covers, aprons, masks, we have masks all over, hair covers, paper towels. I don't know of any food establishment that doesn't have paper towels, but you do also need to have some type of absorbent material. And it could be some materials that are used in basic kits that are provided for bodily fluid cleanup, but baking soda is an acceptable material. There's different types of kitty litter that would work as an absorbent material. Some of the kits that are provided, and I'm going to show you a picture of a kit, you really need to have a way to get the stuff up. So a disposable scoop, maybe a scraper, and again, anything that you can use that is disposable is ideal because this virus is so highly contagious. Also large plastic bags with twist ties, and some of the kits that I've seen, they actually have biohazard bags so that it's identified as something like norovirus. Another thing that we don't think of is that you need to have caution tape for closing off the area. And again, I'm going to talk about kits that you can purchase. And I've noticed not all kits are equal, but I have also noticed that most of the kits that I've seen for cleanup do not provide caution tape. And again, as you can see, the virus can float in the air. It spreads within a 25-foot radius of the person. So you really want to keep people out of that area. And the best way to do that is put up the caution tape to keep them out. And then again, just like we dealt with COVID, we want to have the disinfectant that is effective against norovirus. But some other things that you probably already have: buckets. You need to have a bucket, wiping cloths, detergent, so you can clean those areas with soap and water that I had talked about, sanitizer. And it's important, if you do use a kit or you go through these items that are that you need for an incident, you need to refill it immediately after use. And again, that's because something could happen the next day or a week or a month later. Be ready, because if you aren't, you're going to have to close down to go get all the items that you will need. I did mention that you do have to use some type of a disinfectant, and I always refer to the EPA list. They had, some of you may recall, they had EP list N, which was so those disinfectants that were effective against COVID-19 or coronavirus. This list that I have up here, and you can just Google this, it's the EPA's registered antimicrobial products effective against norovirus. And this is one out of, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 pages. There's multiple items on this list that would be effective. And some of those items on that list, and I'm just putting up a picture here, I'm guessing that some of you already have these products on site right now. I've seen multiple places that routinely have this Ecolab's peroxide multi-surface cleaner and disinfectant. A lot of places have the micro-clean. Again, some of the chlorine, Clorox products are going to be effective against this virus. And then this one is a friend of mine who is actually listening in a presentation that she had given about 2.5 years ago. She said the granddaddy of them all is this Purell body fluid spill kits. And this is important because I don't know if you can see this or not. There's 2 full kits in here, but it specifically states on the very bottom here that it is effective against norovirus. So if you are opting to purchase a kit rather than go stock it yourself, it's very important that you assure that the chemicals in the kit are effective against norovirus. I am going to stop here. I have talked a lot about the procedures that are required for cleaning up these incidents and the kit that's required. And I've talked a little bit about norovirus, which is the rationale behind this entire regulation. Do I have any questions before I move on?
Again, anyone can feel free to unmute or put a question in the chat for me to relay it. I'm not seeing anything at the moment. Apparently, Lisa, you're crystal clear with everything. No questions.
Except for the technical stuff, which is very complicated. So I can either read from the slide and bore everybody or try to explain it in my own terminology. Anyway, let me move on. I'll talk a little bit about IPM, and then I think at that point we can go back into doing a Q&A at the end here. So IPM, the reason I decided to bring this up, I wasn't going, at the very beginning, I provided everybody with an agenda for these 3 weeks, and this wasn't included, but I'm starting to find this is an issue at a lot of places that we're going to. So I felt it important to include this in the training. Pest management is a critical component of your food safety program. And really, IPM, the integrated pest management, is everything that you do that's going to help prevent and control your pests. And it's really up to the PIC and everybody working for an establishment to keep on top of these issues. So here's something that's very interesting. When we changed our food code, and this happened October of 2018, we adopted the 2013 food code. And one of the big changes in this section was that all establishments must be free of pests. And I remember talking to health inspectors about this, talking to our clients, everybody realizing that this is a nearly, if not impossible, goal to reach. You have food, you've got open doors, you have open windows, you're going to have pests. But I really tell people, if you do everything in your power to prevent them from coming in, to keep them under control, that will help with your overall goals. And I have some real basic common sense rules when it comes to pests. Deny them access. As much as possible, keep doors and windows closed. If in the summertime when it's hot outside and you don't have air conditioning, any of your windows or your doors that have screens on them need to have screens that will keep out any flying insects. And speaking of flying insects, a lot of places do have things that are called an air curtain. If you haven't heard of an air curtain, it's literally a blast of air that will help prevent flying insects from coming into an establishment. But other ways that we deny them access is inspecting all deliveries that come in. Believe it or not, this is a common way that pests are going to come into a facility. And some of the things that I've heard about and read about over the years is cockroaches coming in boxes like liquor boxes that we have, the corrugated boxes. The cockroaches can lay eggs and live in the corrugated part of the boxes. But produce, I have heard of all sorts of things, from ladybugs to worms to spiders to on bananas. Shipment of bananas came in with tarantulas. So just inspect anything that is coming in. Any suspicion that something is infested, do not bring it in, because it's going to be nearly impossible to get them out. But it's also important to deny any past food, water, and hiding places. And this to me is a common sense thing. In my family, when I was growing up, my dad, who didn't want to have my mother's relatives visit, likened pest control to this. He would tell my mom, if we don't give them food, anything to drink, or a comfortable place to sleep at night, they won't stay for long. And I think there's an equivalent with pest control here. Deny them food. Keep your food off the floor. Keep all food in tightly covered containers. Clean the floors, clean the drains. Other things that I see, trash cans need to be cleaned. They need to be covered at the end of the day if they contain food debris. Get rid of the garbage at the end of the night. Any water, small amount of water is all that you need to sustain these pests. So if you have leaking pipes, if you have condensation from refrigerators just trickling on the floor, repair this equipment, replace the equipment. And then hiding places. Pests don't want to be seen. They want to hide. So get rid of stuff that's not necessary to your establishment, whether it's old equipment or old boxes of napkins that you no longer use, old holiday decorations, old clothing, uniforms, or whatever, anything that they can use to hide or make nests out of, they're going to stay. And then finally, you really do need to work with a pest control company to make sure that you are working together to keep pests out of your facility. And a good pest control company is going to work with you. They're going to provide a report to you. They're going to give you recommendations on how to deal with pests if you are having an infestation. So I realize I'm trying to stop around 6 or shortly thereafter 6. I've gone a little over time, but I do want to open this up the last 10 or 15 minutes to questions, and not just questions from what we talked about today, but from the very beginning, talking about some of the basics and the risk factors and some of the issues that we had talked about last week. And I'm going to go to my very last slide, which is any questions, and then I'm going to actually stop sharing my screen so I can see people and actually look at any questions that pop up. Anybody?
I'll just comment from the video if you wanted to look at those.
What's that?
Oh, the comments are the last thing from the vomiting video that I find. Some of them are pretty funny.
Yeah, I think we should load that beefed up with sanitizing solution, let it go. This is Lisa. I just want to say thank you, because I think it's very helpful to hear this as, for me, a refresher, because I went through the course like 3 years ago So it's very helpful and helpful to both hear it and read it. So thank you very much for presenting this in sort of digestible form.
So to speak. Thank you, Lisa. I appreciate the feedback, and it is a lot of technical. I think even for health inspectors, it's very technical, and it was such a big change for everybody. And here's what is difficult with some of these topics that I talked about today. These are all new topics as of 2018, and health inspectors were beginning to get trained on these new requirements, and then COVID hit and then everything stopped. And so everything new that people started to learn, I think, was kind of forgotten, and people started going back to their old ways. And you know, I think needed that we can refresh people on what the new requirements are and the rationale behind them. It's all fine and dandy to say you got to start date marking and you got to have these procedures, but without knowing the rationale or the reasons behind them, it's almost like what's the point here? So it's fun for me to talk about the rationale and actually show that video. So I think I will start to use that in my classes going forward.
Lisa, I had a question that was direct message. So just to define what TCS foods are a little bit clearer, or to refresh.
Time temperature control for safety food is literally foods that require time temperature control for safety. So what that means is those foods that could potentially make people sick if they are out of temperature control. So for example, going back to my initial, and I might be able to do this slide from way back when. Hold on just a second. I'm going to go up to the very beginning and I might share this with people. Do you mind if I share this again really quick, Diana?
Totally fine.
I think this might be helpful to talk about this. So I'm hoping that we see the slide here, that we have foods that require time temperature control. So they require refrigeration or freezer, but require refrigeration in order to be safe. So these products, my high protein animal-based foods, our fish, our meat, our eggs, our whether it's cooked chicken or raw chicken, they have to be refrigerated. Otherwise, the bacteria that's normally found on these foods will begin to grow rapidly. And these are things we know automatically. We get home from the grocery store, they go into our refrigerator right away. This is a category that's very obvious, I think, to most of us. The others are a little more confusing. So as we had talked about on the first day, our heat treated plant foods, which is what the FDA says, it's their jargon. What you and I would say in the real world is our cooked fruits or vegetables. So these items, my asparagus, my corn, my potato, perfectly safe at room temperature. But once we heat treat them in any way, we bake them, we fry them, we broil them, we blanch them, they, just like those other items from my previous slide, will allow bacteria to grow. So if they're hot, they have to stay hot. If they're cold, they have to stay cold. And those magic numbers that I always talk about is 41 or colder for cold, 135 or higher for hot. And then I don't have a great name for my other food items, but as we all realize, the last few years, we've had many incidents with romaine lettuce. So our cut leafy greens. So romaine lettuce, it could be spinach, raw sprouts. I did mention some new items that were added when we adopted the food code. Cut tomatoes, whether they're sliced or diced, that's a relatively new item because we have identified that these items out of temperature control will allow bacteria to grow to the point where it could cause illness or injury. And then cut melon, tofu, and garlic and oil mixtures were also those foods that have to be under temperature control. So at room temperature could be dangerous if they are left out at temperature control. Did that help with the definition? And I'm going to stop sharing my screen now.
I didn't get an answer, but someone's asking, how does that apply to baked goods?
Depends on what's in the baked good. So something like bread, I'm not worried about. If it's just the dough, yes. But once you bake it, I'm not worried about bread. I'm not worried about muffins or brownies. However, you could add like creams or custards or some type of filling that could potentially make it a TCS food, requiring that these baked items are refrigerated. The question here I have about cookies, unless there's something added, for the most part, cookie is not a TCS food at room temperature. That is perfectly safe.
And I was like, I know this business, a lot of sugar cookies and stuff like that. So they should be fine unless they started adding fresh fruits to them.
Yeah, and that's another thing is sometimes I don't answer fully, or I just say cookies are perfectly fine. And then I later find out that somebody did add like fresh fruit to it. They have, you know, I don't know, cut melon on the side or part of the cookies on top or something, or they've added some type of a custard, or they put something on the inside. So plain old cookie, sugar cookie, chocolate chip cookie, I am not worried about. I'm not worried about the bread or the muffins or any of those other items. Any other questions?
Like we said before, feel free to unmute as well. It can be a little bit more interactive than just the chat. And I think everyone, I put it in the chat too. I will be putting up or emailing the different slides that we had from over the last 3 weeks, and I'll be working on getting the recording of all of these trainings put up, hopefully on YouTube or a similar video player. And I'll be emailing that out to everyone so that you guys have access to this information later. But any other questions? I feel like there has to be at least one. It was pretty technical. Like even I'm like thinking about it.
Well, it is technical, and you know, each time I do a HACCP plan or SOPs for these, I go back and look at the material. You know, what's required, what documentation is required, the date marking. I have yet to walk into one establishment that gets it right. Yet it is confusing for people. Actually, I'm going to add something on about the date marking, something that I have found has helped some of our clients, because what happens with date marking, not only is it when you open or prepare something that counts as day number 1, and then you have 7 days. But then when you start looking at the calendar, what do you do if you're like October 29th? How many days are in October? Is it 30 days or 31 days? So what I've told some of my clients to do, especially when there are language barriers, is to put a little whiteboard up on the wall saying, this is today's date. Anything that you open or anything that you prepare, this is the date in which it's be consumed or discarded. And that way somebody who's working there doesn't have to think about it. They know that date is what goes on everything. Or the little stickers. The stickers I loved, but again, if you do use stickers for your date marking, that is going to have to be approved by your health inspector. And I don't know, Diana, if you're able to even answer this right now, or you have to discuss it with others, but if that is something that you would approve, but it seemed to be very simple procedure or alternative to the date marking requirements.
Yeah, I'm all about simple. So whatever makes sense for people. I think we just have to formalize people actually submitting the procedures. So now we're doing our permit renewal. So if people have procedures written up, like a quick paragraph or something, they could always submit it there as well. Because I know, for example, at Domino's Pizza, like their policy is just putting expiration dates on everything. That's been explained to me and I approved that. That was totally fine because that makes it easier for everyone that the only date on the container is a date that we're throwing it out. It's less confusing. So something like that we've approved, and as long, for me, it's easier as long as I know like what you guys are doing, whether it's the prep date or the use by date. We just want to know. So, you know, with the smaller places, it's usually the same 4 or 5 people, 2 or 3 people working. And I understand that they probably know how they're rotating stuff, but I always explain like, I need to know what's going on here too when I come in, make it easy for everybody.
So I'm reading, I just got another question. I can see this now, Diana. So hot food can potentially go under 135 for up to 4 hours and still be okay. Yes, believe it or not. If you recall, or if you ever went through a full food protection course, they will go through a little acronym called FAT-TOM. These are the 6 conditions that must be met for bacteria to grow and survive. The 2 T's in the acronym stand for time and temperature. So bacteria like temperatures of those TCS foods between 41 and 135, yet the bacteria really doesn't grow to dangerous levels up until roughly that 4-hour mark. So we know based on science that those TCS foods sitting between 41 and 135 is safe, but you can't just willy-nilly do that. You have to have very specific procedures on how you're going to be monitoring time. If you don't have specific procedures and it's not in writing, there's the risk that the food goes into 6 hours or 7 hours, and then people completely lose track. And now you've got either an illness or an outbreak on your hands. So up to 4 hours, absolutely safe, but you have to have very, very specific procedures. It needs to be reviewed by the health department. There are sample SOPs online for not only using time as a public health control, which I recommend people use, but also for alternative procedures for people using date marking. There's available information online to help you kind of weed through that and figure out the best process for you. But what works for you might not work for your next door neighbor or vice versa. Everybody's establishments are very different.
And speaking of SOPs, I wanted to remind everyone in that email that I had sent out with the renewal information, I believe I included sample SOPs. If I didn't, I'll send it out again this week. But I know we have for the food employee reporting agreement, we include that. Whenever anyone had to go through the plan review, we did include sample SOP for vomit and diarrhea cleanup. So if anyone needs that, we do have that available. And I believe we have it translated in different languages too. Definitely have it in Spanish. I think we might have it in Portuguese. I'll double check, but that could be useful for some staff who do have that language barrier so they understand what they need to do in terms of cleanup. See. I don't see any other questions. Any other questions? And if you guys think of questions after, you could always email me and I can pass it on to Lisa if I can't answer.
So, and I just wanted to thank everybody, all of you that are on today. I recognize the names and some of the faces, and you stuck through with this 3 weeks in a row on Monday nights. I appreciate your attention and your questions. And without any other questions tonight, I think out of respect for you and your valuable time, we can end this training. And I know from me, thank you very much. I appreciate everybody being on. I know Diana appreciates all of you attending and asking questions and being available and giving up your Monday nights 3 weeks in a row for a food safety training. So thank you, everybody.
Yep, thank you. Now I'm gonna
Thank you both.
stop recording here,
Happy
but
holidays.
thanks, and everyone
you.
have a good Thanksgiving.
You
Thanks.
too. Happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you. Happy Thanksgiving.